No, he isn't yet.
Okay. We are live right now, right?
Yeah, so we are live now, and I think we can start the webinar.
Yeah. Welcome again to this session, Fireside Conversation with Aakar Patel. Aakar is a columnist, a writer. He has been with Amnesty India for a very long time, earlier as an executive director, and now he's also on the board of Amnesty India. And we would be discussing with Aakar in this session on the closure of the civic spaces in India, as well as the current state of human rights and how the closure of organizations like Amnesty itself reflects on the derogation of human rights in India. Welcome, Aakar, to this conversation. Thanks a lot for joining us today.
Thanks very much for having me. Absolutely.
So, Aakar, because this is a fireside conversation, we did not expect you to prepare anything in advance. So we just wanted to start by asking you a question. And obviously, the very first question is about the closure of the Amnesty India. We know that Amnesty India is going through a court case right now in India. Can you walk us through what happened and what is the future of Amnesty within India?
So the word is suspension because we haven't been formally charged yet. What the government has done is it's frozen the bank accounts, which means that we don't have access to them without any formal charge. So there's no court case because there is no case in the government yet. There might be one in the future, I don't know. What brought us here is a series of events where we've been targeted for the work that we've done, and I can talk about the work later. But I joined in 2015. The following year, we had a station case filed against us by the student wing of the BJP called the ABVP. Out 3 days. Following that, it took a year and a half for the police to come to the conclusion that there was no case. The court threw it out. The complainant did not show up even once. We lost a lot of our supporters in that period, and we went through a period of discomfort because of the way that we were manhandled in the media. In 2018, we had a series of raids, and a raid is exactly what it sounds like. It's a group of officers who come with a policeman, and they storm into your office. They seize all the material. You have no rights. You have to surrender your phone. Our server was cloned by a private party that the government brought in. We were not given a copy of it later. And at that point, the accounts were frozen for the first time. Once again, there was no formal charge. There was only an accusation. It took us 3 months to get the bank accounts unfrozen. Once again, it came with a lot of, what's the word, infamy in the press. And we were able to get in 3 months' time back to working. This was in January 2019. My term was to end in June 2019. But I had to stay back for a few more months because the organization was not able to find. In June, while I was there, again, there was a raid by the CBI, which is the federal police. We went through the same thing again. A seizure of documents, a cloning of the server. We had to give up the space that we had on rent because we no longer had access to money. We had to let go of a lot of stuff. Then 2019 was the time when we believed, at the point when I left the organization formally at the end of November 2019, that we were fine because we had got relief from the courts. Then in 2020, on the same set of transactions, for the third time, we faced an attack. Once again, the bank accounts were frozen. And at this point, we were not able to get them open soon enough to be able to save the jobs of our colleagues. So we had to let go of about 200 people who were working on things like Kashmir. There is a law in India called UAPA, which allows, like many laws in India, the state to hold people without trial or charge for up to 2 years. Many activists are in jail for being charged under this law. And basically, the government doesn't want us and want groups like 20. It was determined that given the lack of resource, we would suspend operation. I returned to the organization earlier this year because I feel that even if we don't have money, we should in some way be able to do some work so that at this point in our country's history, we don't have absolutely nothing in terms of so we plan on some possibilities to go to the Supreme, which we will examine. But as I said at the beginning, right now there is no formal charge against us, but we are not able to cooperate.
Yeah, and thanks, Aakar, for walking this through. I know as much as I know you so far, I've come to know you so far, I know that you are a very strong personality when it comes to human rights and civic spaces. And the fact that you are now back in Amnesty India and without Amnesty even having funds is something that perhaps you are one of the few people who would be able to do that and stand up for human rights, irrespective of whether there are funds or not. I saw Alina raising her hand, so I'm going to let Alina ask her question.
Thank you, Ritu. We're facing a little bit of an internet connectivity issue. So if at any point, both for the audience and for Aakar, if we're not able to hear each other, it's because it's an internet issue. We've had this is day 4 of the EU-India People's Summit, and we've had some conversations before this with for instance, the chairman of the European Union's India delegation and some other people in similar positions. And they said some, in my opinion, controversial things in regard to India's rule of law by asserting that India and the EU are natural partners since India has a strong tradition of rule of law in their view. And we tried to challenge this and would also like to challenge this view further through your insights. Does India have a rule of law tradition in that sense? And given the existence of laws like the UAPA and the FCRA, which is for the viewers, the Foreign Contributions Regulations Act, under the guise of which Amnesty has been shut down or suspended, can we talk about India having a rule of law and therefore being a trustworthy partner for the European Union?
I think it's a good question. I'd say 2 things. One is all nations are run through law. A nation could be democratic, it could be theocratic, it could be autocratic. All 3 of these nations will have laws. It is not that China doesn't have law. In that sense, we need to ask ourselves what rule of law means. I suppose the question is whether the law itself adheres to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to the covenants on civil and political rights, and to your own constitution. Do some laws in India adhere to our own constitution? And I suppose that would be the test of something being rule of law. So to take a few laws of the recent past, we have introduced religion into citizenship for the first time. From our neighboring countries, anybody who's not a Muslim and not Jewish can claim citizenship if they came to India without documentation before December 2014. Does that mean that it is a violation of the secularism principle of the Constitution? I would say it is. There are laws in parts of India. Gujarat, for instance, Mr. Modi's state has a law which forbids Muslims from buying a property outside of their ghettos. So anybody who's leasing or buying property has to submit in these parts of that state, which is most cities, a sworn affidavit which reveals their faith. And there are parts of Gujarat where foreigners can buy property, but Gujarati Muslims cannot and lease. Is this a violation of the secularism principle? I would say it is. Gujarat again has a law which punishes cow slaughter with life in jail. This is ostensibly an economic crime, but there is no other economic crime in India which draws this kind of punishment. We have reversed the burden of proof on Muslims. So beef possession in Gujarat has a reversal of the burden of proof. If I am found next to a corpse with a gun in my hand, it is for the state to prove that I committed the murder. But if I am accused of having beef in my fridge, it is for me to prove to the satisfaction of the state that that meat is not beef. And there was a man who was convicted, who was who was given a life sentence in 2019 because he couldn't prove to the satisfaction of the court that the meat that was served at his daughter's wedding was not beef. We have the right to propagation, and we have the right to freedom of religion. But in most parts of this country, if you want to change your faith, you have to fill out a form, tell the government why it is that you want to change your faith, what your salary is, what your caste is, the reasons you want to change your faith, who are the people you're going to call to the ceremony. And if you don't do that, there is jail. Does this mean that we have freedom of religion? I would say no. That Gujarat was told in 2019 that of the roughly 1,800 people who had asked to change their faith over 5 years, half were told no, you can't. It was mostly the Dalits who wanted to convert into Buddhism who were told yes. So this goes against what the Constitution tells us. The Constitution gives us fundamental rights such as the right to a peaceful assembly, but we don't have it. To assemble outside a government office to have a peaceful protest of 5 people or 6 people, we have to fill out a form and we have to ask the police for permission. Usually it is not granted. Sometimes they do not reply. It is the police's right to say yes, no, or maybe. We have the right to freedom of speech, but freedom of speech is criminalized in India. We've got sedition, we've got contempt, we've got defamation, we've got 153A. You could be charged with hurting somebody's feelings on the grounds of their community and jailed for it. So it clashes with what we would call ordinarily as a fundamental right. So to come back to the point I made originally, all countries are run through the rule of law. It is whether the law itself adheres to certain grand global principles. India is not only a signatory, but it was one of the nations that participated in the writing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Does it not have the obligation to follow them? The other point is that I think the geopolitics of our time necessarily means that the European Union and the US seek to balance the power and the rise of China through India. That India is seen as in some ways a foil for their engagement with China. And though they will accept, I think, the fact that we are not perfect, nor are they, of course, they believe that we are good enough for them to be able to partner with when it comes to China. So I think that this kind of joining at the hip of the relationship between India and China and the EU needs to be separated. I think that we need to be seen for who we are, separately from whatever it is that the EU sees China as.
That's a very, very fair point that you raised regarding the European Union kind of seeing India as the lesser evil. This is a trend that has come up repeatedly in our conversations, which is worrying, to put it lightly. At the same time, there are voices within Europe which, after the closure of Amnesty, after the suspension of Amnesty, spoke out quite vocally. And I myself, I'm German, I grew up in the European Union, and when Amnesty closed, I thought, oh God, this is a huge loss. And I tried to reach out to as many people as I could to just get a statement out there. And a lot of people ask me, Elena, what is the purpose of a statement? What good is that going to do? If somebody passes a resolution in Parliament in Europe, what's even the point of that? Can you elaborate on that? Is there a value to just showing international solidarity? Is it just nice and showing empathy, or is there an actual consequence that can come out of such international solidarity?
I think there are two things at play here. One is the idea of solidarity and of fraternity, that we feel that there are people who are looking out for us. The second is, I think India, because it's democratic, it in some sense is vulnerable to external pressure. Our claim when we go to the European Union is not that we are this Hindu nation. When we engage the outside world, we say we are a pluralist, secular, constitutional, rule of law, a democracy, and that claim tends to be put to test when it is pointed out from the outside that this might not necessarily be true. So I think on both these counts, and I'll give you a very specific example. The citizenship law that I spoke about, which excludes Muslims and Jews from claiming asylum in India, of those people from our neighboring countries who came to this place before December 2014, was legislated a year and a half ago, but it is still not law on the ground. The rules for it have not been framed. Even if you came under the conditions laid out in that law, you still cannot claim citizenship because of a pressure, especially from the EU. So the EU members of parliament wrote up and they tabled a very strong resolution condemning the law, but India asked them not to vote on it, which they didn't, and which they still have not. But that motion, which I did not expect because the language is extremely strong, rightly so, is the reason why that law is not actually operational. And in that sense, it helps us that a statement, a motion be made from outside of India. Kashmir was under an internet blockade for a year and a half. Kashmir's children spent the entire 12 months of 2020 not having gone to school because they did not have access even to online classes. The Biden administration took over on the 20th of January. On the 4th of February, India lifted the blockade. One reason for it is once again, there was a resolution, a motion in the US House of Congress, Congresswoman Jaipal, which condemned India for what it was doing in Kashmir. And we were affected by it so much that the foreign minister of this country refused to meet a delegation that had this congresswoman in it. And I would suggest that one reason why the blockade in Kashmir was lifted 15 days after Biden took over was that India did not want to face further condemnation on this specific. It absolutely helps us. Please continue to write, even if it's just one of you. For these two reasons. One is solidarity, and the other is that it will help.
Aakar, I also had a question, and which is basically looking at both what happened in the parliaments in the Western European country, because I know that almost every parliamentarian, irrespective of whether they were reached out by Amnesty or otherwise, they did raise the question on the closure of Amnesty in India. And I also have a question with respect to the resolution which Alvina Almatsa recently drafted and tabled in the EU Parliament. And in that resolution, a lot of right-wing parties have actually, under European parliamentarians who have actually supported the freedom of religion. Because in the conservative scene of Europe, the freedom of religion is one of the main talking agendas here, right? So how do you see the support by, not the left liberal or the center parties, but rather the right-wing parties of the freedom of religion in India? How do you reconcile that support? Because in some ways it is also a political saying within the European Union that, the conservative parties are supporting freedom of religion, but more in terms of the Christian freedom of religion, rather than a secular notion of religious freedom. So how would you as Amnesty perhaps reconcile that idea of their support?
Amnesty hasn't worked on this specific issue, so I can't speak on behalf of the organization on this point. But I would say that on the limited matter of the fact that India does not have freedom of religion for its citizens, it's true. Whether or not person A says it or whether a person B says it, it doesn't change the fact. I would welcome any kind of pressure from any group on the government of India to lift all the restrictions on the freedoms that are guaranteed by the constitution but have been imposed by the state. If China were to say that there is something wrong happening in India, or Pakistan were to say it, I don't think it should be rejected purely for the fact that it is some kind of person or some kind of state that is saying it, or some form of group. Fact is, I would ask myself whether what it is that they are saying is true or not. In this instance, certainly it is true that what they that their support to the rest of the parliamentarians on the issue of freedom of faith is true. It is also the case that, and I'm speaking about a cultural phenomenon now, that Article 25, which is the right to propagate, was sought for specifically by the Christians of this country. The Constituent Assembly debates, because for them, a propagation is an article of faith. It is not an article of faith for most of the rest of us. They want to spread the message, the good word of Jesus. And they asked what is right, it was given to them. It was removed in part before the BJP came in through various laws in various states. But the hardening of it has certainly happened in the recent past. And so even if it is true that right-wing parties in Europe, specifically on the issue of Christian propagation, have raised the matter with this country, what they're saying is true.
Thanks a lot, Aakar, because I really wanted you to come on the point which you mentioned, that this is a universal freedom of religion and we as nation should be standing up for it, irrespective of who's actually talking about it. With this, I would like to pass to Snehal, who has raised her hand as well for a question to you. Snehal, please.
Thank you, Ritu. So my question is that we saw that last week Colombia introduced a tax reform and the citizens, they protested against it. And yesterday the president rolled back the tax reforms. But in India, we saw the CAA protest which started on in December and they lasted till the advent of COVID. And then it's been more than 100 days that farmers here are protesting against the farm laws, but there has been no positive response from the government side. So what do you think that the message here is? Like, what message are we getting from the government? Because there is no response at all. And I also have another question, and that is, since Amnesty closed down, what impact does it, what impact will it have in the future on human rights and organizations and individuals who are working? Like, we are seeing that many activists, they have already been put inside prisons, but what impact will this have on civil society? So
okay, the first question, it is true that the government did not engage at all with the people who were protesting against the CAA and the NRC. It is also true that those laws are on hold. So the NRC, we are told, has not been discussed. The CAA has been passed, as I said, but it has not been made law. One reason is the external pressure. One reason is also the fact that the government believes that it is too much trouble to be able to be worth whatever benefit it might get from it. And this is a speculation, but that it seems to be the case. And the government, beyond the point when it faces a lot of resistance from the people on the ground, tends to hide or tends to run. A similar thing has happened on the farm laws. So the farmers' protest is on. The laws have been passed, but once again, the laws have been suspended, this time by a court. And the government itself has said that it might be willing to suspend it for 18 months or maybe even longer. So I think that it's important to know that while the government doesn't formally engage sometimes with protesters, it does make a difference to what the government ultimately does. And on these two most controversial laws, though they are law, they have been made law, they've been passed by Parliament. They still have not been implemented, and the reason is the power of protest. So I think that we should look at that, and though we sometimes think that we do not have enough strength within civil society to be able to push back against the government's excesses, look at it in a slightly more nuanced way. It is true that whatever it is that has been done on the street by, say, Muslim women or the farmers of Punjab and Haryana and Northwest UP, it has worked. Amnesty, I think the thing is, what does amnesty add to the human rights narrative space? I think that is the question to ask before we can answer what it is that goes missing when it's not there. So if you look at the OHCHR in 2018, 2019, it put out for the first time in its history 2 reports on Kashmir. And in those 2 reports, there are more than 5 dozen citations of Amnesty's work. The EU-India summit happening in Portugal soon has a reference in the documentation to the shutting down of Amnesty. I believe Amnesty is the only group referred to in the EU motion on CA. This kind of credibility is hard to build. It takes many decades to be able to do this kind of work. Amnesty is evidence-based, so we have our own people on the ground doing the research. We have extremely tight law and policy frameworks on what can be said and what cannot be said. And this is what gives it the credibility to be able to have its material used by institutions like the EU or the UN and so on. So I think what will go if it shuts down, this is one thing we will lose. The other thing we will lose is the fact that not too many Indian groups have the capacity to work on things like Kashmir or UAPA and not get into trouble of a very nasty sort. Amnesty, because of its global presence, because of the fact that it is quite well known, gives us a level of a protection to its activists. It's true that we've been raided and the accounts have been frozen and there's lots of cases that have been filed against us. But we're not in jail yet. And one reason is that the government is afraid to take on groups like ours. We might not be very powerful on the ground. We might not be able to mobilize 50,000 people, even 5,000 people, because we speak a very academic language. Amnesty's human rights language is very legalistic. It comes from the basis of law rather than on the basis of a passion. So we are not, in this part of the world, we are not a mass-based movement, which is true. But because of our global connect, because of the fact that we have brothers and sisters across the world, it's not easy for the government to just come and stop our work by jailing us. But what they can do is they can freeze our bank accounts, which they have done. So I think that if it is the case that we will not be here in the medium and long term, the government will benefit in the sense that it will not have as many people that it fears working on the difficult subjects.
Thanks, Aakar, for that answer. I have Anubandh who has raised his hand, and then I would also like to ask a question to you afterwards. Anu, you go first.
Hello, Aakar. So I'm Anubandh. I'm based in Paris. I have 2 questions for you. So we have seen that there have been international interventions or governments, officials, politicians have expressed their views regarding what's happening in India. And the government's response has been predictable in a way, trying to be protective and saying this is our internal matter. But for someone like me who grew up in India, and I remember this phrase, where we repeat that Kashmir is an integral part of India, and this is our internal matter, So, I mean, this is now going beyond, how do we decide? Do we all out say that no internal interference, let's say, or comments could be made, or there are certain things which the international community should agree, accept that we could have exchanges and comments, Also because, for example, recently the Australian newspaper also wrote an article which was critical, and the government again tried to influence, or express its displeasure. That's first question. Now, second is, given this background, what do you think should be
Sorry.
Yeah.
Could you just repeat the? I sort of heard you as far as your first line, and then the line dropped. So you said that whether it was the case that we should treat everything as being internal and resist whatever it was that was coming in externally, and beyond that I couldn't hear it. Sorry.
Yeah, no, so in one line I would say, where do we draw this line? Which matter is an internal matter to a country and which could be debated,
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
Right, so that, right. Second is, given this background, what do you think should be and is the Indian diaspora's role? One could be to further continue, gather this international solidarity, being critical about India, what's happening. Another could be also in their own capacity to continue the critical assessment of what is happening in India. Or do you see any other roles or possibilities for the diaspora? Thank you.
So on the second point first, I think that here in India, we can do three things. We can vote, we can go to court, and we can have a protest. So we've got these three options in which we can push back against the government's excesses. But I think advocacy is something that neither groups in India fully appreciate, because we've never had the capacity in the past. And I think because of your first question, many of the groups have not actually indulged in it too much because of the idea that this is an internal matter. So, for instance, if you look at caste, a lot of well-meaning people across the world have tried to raise the issue of caste at the level of the UN, but India has always resisted, saying that we've got laws on it, and this is our internal matter, and we will take care of it. But we are not able to take care of it. That is the problem. That my saying that this is my house and whatever I do in it is my business is fine if you have that level of sovereignty. If you want to say, as you do, that I'm part of a larger world, I want to be part of the United Nations. In fact, I want to be on the high table and share it with the permanent five, which is what India wants. If you're a signatory to declarations that in good faith you wrote up yourself and then you signed on to, then you should be held to account. I think if governments in India, people might not know that the largest violator of law in this country is the state. Most of the litigation in this country happens, whether it's civil or whether it is a criminal, happens with the state. If the entity that is responsible for rule of law itself breaks the law, it should be called out. I think there is nothing wrong in it. And I think that because you people have a stake, more of a stake in us, certainly than the others who are equally well-meaning but might not necessarily have family here, it is incumbent on you to unionize and raise your voice in favor of us and in favor of the rest of us as loudly as you can. It works. I think that because the citizen in the West and Europe and the US is able to influence her legislator in a way that we can't. If you have sufficient numbers of people writing to their legislator, whether in Paris or in Rome, saying that the CA is a law that India should not have and which damages its constitution, you should gather people and push your local legislator into forcing India to change. Nothing wrong with it. We can't do that to that extent because we don't have the access. We are not citizens of those states. We would like them to act, but we do not have enough influence on them directly. Certainly, we have it through the offices that Amnesty runs in Brussels or in New York or in Washington. But it would be great if more people in the diaspora took an active interest in what was going on in this country. But I think that we are reaching a tipping point. I don't think that this is the same India that I knew 30 years ago or even 20 years ago. We've never been the kind of state that looks at its marginalized communities with any degree of sympathy, never. But the state hasn't been actively participating in drawing up laws that brutalize them further. This is new. Even if you leave aside the lack of competence in running the pandemic, I'm saying that we are passing laws every month, every week, every year. One day it's love jihad, one day it's beef ban, one day it's something else that turns the screws on the minorities, pushes them to the margins further, humiliates them all the time, and provokes violence, which the state cannot stop. India claims to be a rule of law state, but 100% of fatalities in beef lynchings have come after 2015. We did not know that category of violence in this country before that. I've been a journalist since '95, and I had never heard of this. Somebody with meat in their van or in their house being assaulted and murdered while half a dozen people film this on their cell phones. This kind of violence, on this lynching is not new on the subcontinent. On this subject, we have actually introduced this because Mr. Modi wanted laws criminalizing possession of beef in 2015, and then 2 states responded, Maharashtra and Haryana. So we are actively doing things that I think need to be stopped, and I think that the intervention of the diaspora is not only necessary, it's extremely urgent.
Thanks a lot for that reply, Aakar. And we do share your sense of bewilderment on what is happening in India. And obviously, we are here to stand up for what is, for how far we can. The other thing that I have, and it actually comes down from Alina's question earlier and your response to Snehal's question on the Amnesty's nature as not being a mass movement-based organization, but rather a human rights-centric organization, which means that it has a very strong embedment in the legal frameworks, right? So is this something that is what scares the state? Because the laws, they are in a Leviathan construction, they are, how to say, to push the state's power, to draw boundaries on the state power. So is it what scares the government in terms of Amnesty? And this is perhaps why we are seeing the closure of Amnesty India and not of other, grassroots driven organizations as much. So your opinions on that?
No, I think that grassroots organizations tend to be more effective in achieving the outcomes that they seek in our part of the world. 1 million signatures, or 1 million people going online and signing a petition will not do anything in India. 10 people on the ground really physically there doing some stuff will make some sort of difference. People will definitely make a very big difference. The reason why the farm laws have been passed but are not activated is because of the fact that 50,000 of them are outside Delhi. The government feels that it's not able to do that. It's used the courts to be able to push the laws back. The reason why CA has been passed but has not been made active is that you had more than 250 groups nationally of Muslim women on 24/7 protests. And I think that really works. Amnesty's role is different. It is able to provide material to both the government of India, because the government of India might not know, for instance, that since 1989, all of the charge sheets that the government police have filed against the armed forces for murder, torture, kidnap, rape has resulted in not a single prosecution in a civil court. And Amnesty had a report on Parliament was told this only in January 2018. Most, or maybe all no parliamentarian knew this, and we knew it much before them because we had done the research. We had gone through all those cases. So it helps the government of India in terms of the evidence on human rights and what laws need to be tweaked or or repealed, it certainly helps the rest of the world. So Amnesty, because it is a global movement, it campaigns through a series of things, but the core of the campaigning is the evidence gathering, which we are very good at, which mass movements may or may not be good at. I would say that the farmers movement has got excellent material in terms of the laws. I think there's legal arguments are very good, but it's the rare case of a mass movement also having a sort of very reasoned set of principles and a kind of framework. Most human rights organizations tend to be split off into those who are active on the ground, who run on the basis of passion, who have which are run by small groups of people. And in India, I would say that the Center for Peace and Justice, run by Tista Setalwad, would be one of them. She's extremely passionate, devoted to her subject, and has been for decades. But they tend not to be mass movements in that sense. So both types of groups are needed. I personally like the mass movement type group better. I was the least qualified person at Amnesty, and I'm not being modest. They were extremely bright young people, PhDs, lawyers from the best law schools, and it was a privilege to work with them.
Thanks a lot for this reply, Aakar. I see Indu has her hand raised. Indu, you can go next.
Yeah, thanks, Ritu. So I want to change the spotlight from the state to social media companies. So your account has been suspended by Twitter for comments, and also recently Twitter had been removing critical tweets of COVID crisis management by the government, and also generally there had been many tweets taken down, and also accounts banned, at least within India. So how do you see this trend, especially because the major social media companies like Twitter is from a country where freedom of expression is very strong, but they act very differently in a country like India. How do you see this trend?
So I think the problem is the law. So Twitter says that it will follow the law. Where it gets a legal request to take down content or to suspend somebody's account, it does so when the government sends it to it. In Europe, this will not happen very often. I don't know if it happens at all. In India, there are so many laws which criminalize free speech that the government can use any excuse to be able to send. There is a 3% team, I'm told, in Delhi that forwards requests from the state government onto the legal or Twitter. And the moment they do that, Twitter is bound to act. They have the option of not acting and then facing a threat. There was a report in the Wall Street Journal a couple of months ago, which said that the people who were managing Twitter, Facebook, and WhatsApp in India were summoned by the government in Delhi and threatened with jail if they did not follow the orders sent to them. So I suppose Twitter and Facebook have two options. They can continue to work in India, have very large numbers of people on their platforms, but then they have to follow the law, which it says that if the government sends them a notice, they can suspend people. There is some pushback they can do. So in my case, while the account was suspended because there was a furor over it, it came back to me after a week or so. But usually there's a very famous Supreme Court lawyer in India who's lost his account on Twitter twice. And this is not because he's anything inflammatory at all. He's not that kind of man, but it's because the government believes that he shouldn't be speaking the truth. Sanjay Hegde. He's still been banned from Twitter. So Twitter can either say, okay, we will do business in India, we'll follow the law, and then based on that, if they get a legal request, they will execute it. Or they can say, we will not be in India. They have that option. All three of these platforms have chosen to be in India. and so they feel that they need to follow the law. I think the problem is the law and the way that the government misuses it rather than the platform itself.
Thanks a lot, Aakar.
I'll just add to that. I think that this is the case with Twitter. I think Facebook is malicious. Facebook deliberately leaves content which is not only hate speech, it is inflammatory and prima facie incitement to murder. Will leave it on because it's BJP content. They will make sure that if there is a hashtag that offends the government of India, we are told that the government of India does not even need to tell them to take it off. They will do it themselves. So I think there is that one difference. I'm not on Facebook myself, but while Twitter, I think, can be accused justly of being cowardly, I think Facebook is an accomplice of the BJP.
Yes, I kind of share that feeling of yours, Aakar, because you know that we have been working on Facebook policies and on monitoring hate speech on Facebook since some months now. And I agree with what you say, that Facebook has been deliberately malicious in India. And I hope we were part of the human rights assessment report, which Facebook itself commissioned by a lawyer for India specifically. And we just hope that they are able to put that report in its entirety outside and not just the executive summary of it, like how they did in Sri Lanka. So let's see what comes up in the next coming weeks. I'll give it over to Anu to ask his question now.
Thank you. Yeah, it's just an extension of what we were just discussing, the freedom of expression. And it's a bit of a philosophical angle, I would say. I mean, the way I see, one of the reasons why we see the rise of the extreme right, in different countries, it is attributed, one of the reasons is attributed to the fact that people feel voiceless, and then the populist leader capture the space saying, I am the voice of the voiceless, and that's what Trump did in a way, right? And we know now that Trump is not on Twitter. So my question is, we have chosen to remove that voice, that option where people who thought that Trump was their voice, that space is removed, whether Trump talk, it was truth or not, what he was propagating, that's certainly an ethical issue. But strategically, do you think that that's the best approach, because again, we're not letting that voice to come out, somewhere. What do you think about this?
I think it's not the right approach. I think curbing the freedom of speech generally works against once we agree in a principle that certain sorts of speeches is not to be allowed, usually it is the weak and the marginalized that gets their voice to be forced to be shut. So generally on this issue of freedom of expression, with one qualification, which I think the world has agreed on, though we don't know what the definition is, which is hate speech. I think that if we can all sort of come to agreement on what hate speech is. In India, I think incitement to violence would certainly qualify, to my mind, as being something that should be taken off. But then what does that constitute? I retweeted a post from a newspaper in Portland, Oregon, of a protest of people who were lying on the ground saying, I can't breathe. And I was booked by the police. The police filed a case against me themselves, saying that this was, incitement to violence. So even there, I think we've got standards that not everybody agrees on. Generally speaking, I would say that I stand for the freedom of speech, and removing it or curbing it in any way tends to harm and hurt those of us who are weak and marginalized first and most, and more than it does those who are powerful. They will get their message out in any case.
Thanks a lot, Aakar, for this thing. And yeah, of course, like in India, Article 19 says that freedom of speech is not absolute, and public order and incitement to violence can always form exclusion to the free speech rights that one may have. So I agree with what you were saying that, yes, if it is incitement to violence, then it may require things to be censored, but then how to define incitement of violence and how to define public order is the challenges ahead. I see Alina raising her hand, and Alina, I also wanted to say that if you may want to ask a question related to the current COVID situation, because we are 10 minutes left in the webinar, so thank you.
Sure, thank you very much. I'll weave in COVID into my question. I studied international law in my bachelor's and had this idea that adherence to rule of law, to one that is rights-based and human rights-based and not just rule by law, the minimum, that would save us all. That if we pound on and insist on human rights, especially freedom of speech, that this will be the way forward. And then I've read one paper, which I still haven't been fully able to wrap my mind around, but which I kind of want to summarize the premise to you and then get your thoughts on that, is the critique of human rights, that human rights only developed, especially civil and political human rights, only developed in the West once there was a solid foundation of economic security, income security, livelihoods, a proper healthcare system, et cetera, et cetera. And that then freedom of speech came up, that then autonomy, et cetera, really became part of the fabric of society in Europe. And that insisting on, for instance, India having a perfectly respected freedom of speech, that this is too much to ask as the foundation isn't there. And this, of course, is kind of a tricky argument to make because it sounds academic, it sounds like it's well-founded in history, but it also kind of gives an excuse to say, well, during the COVID crisis, we don't need to take a human rights approach because we just don't have the resources to do it. To say, oh no, but human rights are important is arguably, and here I want your opinion, to miss the point that India doesn't have the resources to actually pull, especially civil and political human rights off. So what are your thoughts on that? Is it a reality that is too much to ask of India? Or is it actually having a human rights-based approach to access to healthcare that will be the way forward and is a necessary way forward?
So the idea that civil and political and human rights is a recent phenomenon and has come out of nothing because of the Industrial Revolution, I would say is not true. That you've had, wherever you've got a state, whether the state is run by a prince, a king, a landlord, or a democratic government, there will be some framework that society functions under. You could argue that that framework is abhorrent, that you don't agree with parts of that framework or even the whole thing itself. Let's say you have a village which is run on the basis of the caste system. Even within that, there will be punishment which is laid out, there will be rules which are framed, and so on. So the idea that rule of law and rights only comes to us in the recent past, in the post-medieval period, I would say is wrong. The second thing is sometimes modernity might actually make things worse. For example, if you look at Pakistan, till the mid-1980s, there had been only half a dozen cases of blasphemy that had been filed in that country from all the period leading 6 or 7 decades to pre-partition India. But in the 80s, a law was passed which criminalized blasphemy to the extent of life imprisonment and then death. And then suddenly, because it was written into the penal code, in villages in Pakistan, people started to accuse their neighbors of a blasphemy, and they would get lynched. Till the law came into being, till the framework came into being, the crime did not appear to exist. It became a crime only because it was written in the law. So you might have tolerance at the level of local culture, which is disturbed by something which criminalizes it. A second example, Muslim men are the only category of people in India for whom divorce has been criminalized. It's a very strange law. The traditional law, which is 1400 years old, gives some rights to the man and fewer rights to the woman to dissolve the marriage. A Muslim marriage is not a sacrament, it is a contract. Often it is a written contract, and with very specific things such as you shall give me so much money a month and you shall keep me in a separate room from the one that your mother occupies and so on. What India has done is it has made the process of nullifying this contract complex and criminalized it. So the Supreme Court of India said that the Muslim male's dissolution of the marriage through the utterance of the word talaq 3 times in the same sitting was not legal. So at that point, triple talaq, the tradition, became non-lawful in India. But Parliament then passed a law which says that if this word were to be said 3 times in one sitting, it would become a crime, which is strange. So if I were to say to my wife the word talaq, talaq, talaq in one sitting, our marriage would still remain intact and it would not be a crime. If a Muslim man said the same thing to his wife, their marriage would also remain intact, but he would be a criminal. So you had a traditional framework which looked at the dissolution of marriage in a particular way, which has become more complex, less human rights friendly through the introduction of modern law. So I would say that it's not always the case that when you introduce into culture law which has its basis in this instance in common law and Latinate jurisprudence, that you would not have a good outcome. The last thing is that it is good practice for countries to follow their own constitutions. We do not expect that we are given a new set of laws by either the European Union or the African Union or the US. What we want is for the world to pressure India into following its own laws, its own constitution in the right spirit. And I don't think that whether the crisis is COVID or something else, these promises that the Indian people have made to themselves should be suspended. We have a catastrophe happening in this country every year in any case. 38% of our children are stunted. They don't have enough food. They don't have enough sanitation facility for them to reach their full potential, either physically or mentally. 38% of 1.3 billion. So COVID is one thing, but we are always going through in our part of the world some or the other disaster. That doesn't mean that we should suspend or ignore the rights that we should have.
Thank you, Aakar. That was an incredibly hopeful note to end on. I noticed that throughout the entire conversation, you had a lot of little hopeful bits where you said, hey, the CAA hasn't been implemented yet. Hey, we've had movements of people, we've had successes. Even your comment that you're not in jail yet was, although quite morbid, was another one of those hopeful notes. And I really appreciate that, especially since all of us came to this conversation with quite a grim feeling, a feeling of really being lost and stuck and not knowing what to do. At least we know that not all is lost, and we as humans have an incredible capacity to do things. So thank you from the bottom of my heart for that hope.
Thanks
I pass over to Ritu.
The thing to know is that India is an imperfect autocracy. Sorry, I was saying that India is an imperfect autocracy, that we don't have the competence in the state to be able to do what the government desires. We do not have the capacity in the state. They want to brutalize 200 million Muslims. They can't do it. Physically, it's not actually possible. There's always space for us to push back, and we should use that space.
Thanks a lot, Aakar, for this candid fireside conversation and keeping mind of the time that we had today. I would like to thank you for joining us today, and also what Alina said, for those bits of hopes that we are going to cling on to and to the future of solidarity together, and many such conversations to change the dynamics a little bit, perhaps, and not hope for too high ambitions. So thanks a lot, Aakar, for being with us today.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.